Hal Granger walked into the town council meeting in full marine dress blues, holding a fragile yellowed paper, and dropped a 50-year-old bombshell that froze the room cold. The name at the bottom? The councilwoman's own grandfather. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The morning after the hearing, Hal sat at his kitchen table, the same formica-topped one he and Martha had shared Sunday breakfasts at for 40 years. Sunlight filtered through the gingham curtains, catching on dust motes suspended like time itself. His calloused fingers traced the rim of his chipped coffee mug, his mind miles away, in Da Nang, in the Anhua Basin, in that thick, wet heat where men didn't care about fence colors, only whether the man next to them made it through the night. But this wasn't Vietnam. This was Missouri, and this battle had come to him. Hal folded the citation letter neatly, slid it into the folder marked Town Records, and placed it in the worn metal filing cabinet by the hallway. His house was quiet, but his thoughts weren't. He opened the garage. The air smelled of old oil and wood shavings. Against the far wall stood his workbench, organized with precision. Hammers hung like soldiers at attention, screwdrivers lined up by size, and a row of neatly labeled jars filled with every nail and bolt one could ever need. He found the folder he was looking for, yellowed and cracked, labeled Property Permits, 1968. Inside, tucked between carbon copies and smudged blueprints, was the original fence permit. Black ink, official seal, signed by a now-deceased councilman named Eugene Tiller. A legal fence, approved and recorded. Hal closed the folder slowly. Then he pulled out an old Polaroid, one Martha had taken the day he finished building the fence. He stood in the frame, young and square-shouldered, wearing paint-splattered jeans and a grin beneath his Marine Corps cap. Martha had written on the back in looping script, "My war hero builds a fence of peace." Something inside him stiffened. This wasn't about paint. It wasn't about modernization. It was about something deeper, about respect, about erasure, about memory. That fence was a monument, not just to his service, but to his family, to a time when a man's word and his work meant something. And now someone half his age wanted to whitewash it in the name of progress. Hal stood for a long time in front of the fence that afternoon. The forest green was a little faded in spots, sure, but it still held its dignity. He ran his fingers along one of the slats. The wood was strong, still held firm, just like him. He reached up, adjusting the brim of his cap, the one with the eagle, globe, and anchor. He noticed neighbors watching from across the street. Some nodded respectfully, others turned away, and one, young man, new to the block, just stared, expression unreadable. Let them look. By evening he had made up his mind. He wasn't repainting a damn thing. Instead, he set up his old folding table in the front yard and stacked it with copies of the permit and Polaroids of the fence through the years, even a few pictures with local kids leaning against it, Halloween decorations from the 80s still tacked to the slats in some. He added a hand-painted sign. "This fence has stood since 1968. It is legal, historical, and will not be repainted. Respect history. Respect service." And then he sat down behind it, silent and still. Neighbors walked past slower than usual. Some stopped to read. A few offered words of encouragement. Others hurried away, uncomfortable with the quiet defiance. But by nightfall, his message had spread farther than he expected. Someone posted a picture on the town Facebook group. Another neighbor mentioned the story to a friend at the New Liberty Times. And somewhere, inside the sterile offices of Town Hall, Deborah Whitfield received an email with a subject line she didn't like. "Granger's fence, public support growing." But Hal didn't care about hashtags or headlines. He lit a single lamp on the table, pulled on his old field jacket, and leaned back in his chair. He'd stood guard once before. He could do it again. Councilwoman Deborah Whitfield did not flinch, but her stillness spoke volumes. A flicker passed behind her eyes. Recognition? Embarrassment? It was hard to say. She reached for her water glass with practiced grace, but her hand trembled ever so slightly. Across the chamber, Hal stood unmoved, his chest broad beneath the tight lines of his uniform, the rows of ribbons over his heart catching the fluorescent light. The silence in the room was no longer awkward. It had become reverent. The mayor, an affable man with a talent for avoiding hard lines, cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Mr. Granger, if you would allow our legal counsel a moment to authenticate the document—" "I'll allow more than a moment," Hal said calmly, his voice low and certain. "I've waited 55 years. A few more minutes won't break me." He returned to his seat, every step slow but unyielding. When he sat, the room stayed hushed, eyes darting between the mayor, the legal advisor, and the aged paper now resting under a plastic protector. In the first row, Hal's granddaughter, Lily, held her phone tightly. She'd filmed the entire thing, and her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with pride. She had grown up listening to Hal's stories, about the war, about her grandmother, about how a town used to stand still during the national anthem, and children once saluted the flag without being told. She understood this wasn't about a fence. This was about what the fence stood for. Behind her, neighbors who once shook their heads at Hal's stubbornness now whispered differently. Mrs. Ramirez, who lived 2 doors down and had voted for Deborah Whitfield in the last election, folded her arms tightly. She remembered when Martha used to bring over fresh cornbread every Sunday. She remembered when Hal built that fence during long, hot summer days, always with care, always with purpose. It was never just a boundary. It was a promise. The legal counsel, a young man in a blue suit and tortoiseshell glasses, approached the podium. He didn't look up at the crowd. "We've examined the document. The signature is authentic. The council in 1968 granted Mr. Granger permanent permission to construct and paint the fence as a veteran memorial under municipal historical exemption. The permit is binding." A slow ripple moved through the chamber. Hal didn't smile, but his jaw unclenched. The mayor leaned back in his chair, clearly relieved. "Well, that settles the legality." But Hal wasn't finished. He stood again, slower this time, and stepped forward until he was directly across from Deborah Whitfield. He didn't raise his voice, but every syllable landed with weight. "You can call it outdated. You can call it non-compliant. But what you cannot call it is meaningless. That fence was painted for my brothers who never came home. Every slat is a name. Every coat of green is a memory. And this town, your town, honored that once. You don't get to rewrite that history just because it doesn't match your color palette." Deborah stared ahead, silent. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk. He gave her one final look, not of anger, but of solemn expectation. Then he turned to the room. "I'm not asking for praise. I'm asking for remembrance, and a little damn respect." When he stepped down, the applause was thunderous. Not the polite claps of procedural meetings, but the raw kind. Earned, not given. Some stood, some wept, others simply nodded, knowing they'd witnessed something rare. A man carrying the weight of history without bitterness, only resolve. And outside the town hall that night, someone taped a handwritten sign to the flagpole. "Marine Corps green, let it stand." Beneath it, someone else scrawled in ink, "So do veterans, but our service doesn't expire." The late summer sun fell low over New Liberty, casting long golden beams across Hal Granger's lawn, catching in the uneven grain of the old green fence, like light filtering through a jungle canopy. It had been weeks since the council meeting, weeks of interviews, letters, awkward apologies, and unexpected alliances, but now, in the cooling dusk, the dust had begun to settle. And for the first time in years, Hal felt something unusual stir in his chest. Peace, not the lonely kind born of endurance, but the real thing, earned, shared, seen. Redemption had not come with fanfare, nor had it been easy. The national coverage embarrassed him, all that fuss over a fence. But Lily, always perceptive, had said something that stuck. "You didn't just save your fence, Grandpa. You reminded people that history isn't supposed to be convenient." She was right. What had started as a bureaucratic citation had evolved into a reckoning, not just for Deborah Whitfield, but for the entire town. The morning after her public statement, Hal had found her standing at the edge of his yard. No entourage, no cameras, just a woman weighed down by the realization that she'd stumbled into something much older and deeper than zoning laws. Her eyes were tired, but honest. She'd apologized, and for Hal that counted. But what followed caught him off guard. "I want to do something real," she'd said, "to fix more than just a vote." She proposed a new initiative, a restoration program for veteran homes across the county, using funds originally earmarked for beautification projects. Not beige vinyl and plastic planters, but authentic beautification, honoring the stories behind each home. Homes like Hal's, like his neighbor Clarence Davis's, who'd served in Korea and whose porch swing still bore the dent from when his boy left for Iraq. Deborah wanted to help repaint those homes, not in regulation gray, but in the colors chosen by those who had built their lives and memories inside them. That was when Hal had said it, "Only if you help me repaint the back gate. I missed a spot." And she'd smiled, not a politician's smile, but a genuine one, the kind that understood work still had to be done. They repainted it the next afternoon, just the two of them, no cameras, no press, just the slow, meditative rhythm of brush strokes and the soft creak of the gate hinges in the wind. Hal told her stories as they worked. About Martha, about jungle nights in Nam, about the day he came home and painted the fence while his newborn daughter slept in a basket nearby. Deborah listened, not out of obligation, but out of the kind of reverence that comes when someone finally sees the full picture. The ordinance was repealed unanimously 2 weeks later. The council chambers were packed, but no one needed convincing. Deborah introduced the repeal herself, voice steady, eyes resolute. In the crowd, Hal sat beside Lily, arms folded, watching the tide turn not with triumph, but with quiet satisfaction. 3 days later, a small crew came out to install the plaque. Hal stood nearby, arms behind his back, watching them anchor it into the soil at the base of the fence. The engraved bronze shone dully in the sun. This fence stands not as a violation, but a memory, in honor of all who served and all who remember. He didn't cry, but something loosened in him that day, a knot of years, of loss, of feeling like the world had moved on without honoring those who had paved its way. Now, every time someone passed by and paused at the fence, Hal felt it. He had held the line, not with force, not with anger, but with truth, patience, and green paint. And in that quiet stand, he had reminded a town and a granddaughter what dignity really looks like.